And once you do this, you can now clearly see this wall is actually blocking the view of exactly what the game is glitching when zoomed out. So I have done numerous videos on Marble Arena 2 at this point, discussing how it works and things like that. However, what's even more bizarre about this is that none of these are even really about it. I don't find this immerse as a game very interesting. Rather, I find interest in the editor. It gives me kind of an odd vibe in some ways, and upon researching it, that eventually led back to the root which the game was forked from, and a host of incredible information on what powers it in the first place. So hopefully I can explain just how the game and its engine are so interesting to me. Now I don't think you'll miss any important context if you haven't seen my old videos. I have talked about some of this, but honestly not very well because of how unnaturally I was talking at that point. So without further ado, here's my explanation of the Cube game engine Iceberg. In case I haven't talked about this enough, it's a move and jump 3D platform game where you play as a marble, with a built-in cubic style editor that contains texture options, collectibles, force fields, gravity bubbles, and more. It was the first 3D level creator that I got into, which was several years ago now, and I've learned both from that as well as since then. Perhaps similar to that of some other early game design 3D computer enthusiasts with, say, Gary's Mod or what have you. But when this game was published, at least at the Mac App Store, it was seen more as just a game than a learning resource on any merits, and mostly dismissed as simply a lackluster game with circusy music, palette-esque textures, and just an overall carnival-style vibe. And I'm not really arguing with that. I don't think any of that is necessarily great. When I first played the game though, I found it kind of cool, and frankly I still do find these levels interesting, but now might be a good time to move on. This game used to have its own website, and it was used as a place to share custom levels. Sadly, they seem to have stopped maintaining it by 2017, around when I first got this Mac Mini. As it happens though, it was archived by the Wayback Machine before that. It was also a place to post scores, time, and things like that, as evident by this window when you finish levels, as well as a place for guidance on the game and its editor. However, it does seem like they plan to add more guidance to the game's site. It seems incomplete, almost like they've given up on it. Many of these said coming soon, and in fact they do have a YouTube channel where they posted walkthroughs and editing guides, but it's not that much there either. It seems like a similar thing might have happened. They also apparently offered computer games as prizes for best times and scores in the game. Just over a year and a half after it stopped working, the site's domain name was overtaken by some random redirect, and the game's launch window actually tries to connect with this and display the page. So every time you start the game, it will actually display that through it. I'm not at all sure who these people are that want this domain name for that. Like, seriously? I also found that if it has sound, it will continue playing even after you get to the main game, meaning the launch window, therefore the site, is actually still running in the background. To avoid them, you could disable Wi-Fi connection while that's running. Speaking of that launch window, it also has a Show User Game Files option, which opens the game's app support folder in Finder. This folder resides in the library folder inside the home folder, so it's inside a folder with many others beside it, inside a folder which is hidden by default, grayed out if you do reach it, and which also contains many other folders inside of it, making it really obscure to the newcomer I used to be. So that helped me discover things like the sound files that Bejeweled 3 puts there, and to be able to modify them. In this game, you can save progress with a manual save in the options, quick save which is F5 and F6, or reload from either one of those or an autosave. Quick save and latest save work for me, but if I try and load a game any other way, the window closes and does nothing. I talked to this person in my comment section that kind of resurrected my interest in this, about having the same issue, and he said, yeah, I use Windows 10. Something to do with the Mac version, I guess. If you look at the app support folder, it has a folder called Packages. After finding that though, I discovered how to open the contents of applications, and what's interesting is that if you look at this game, it also has a folder called Packages. It not only contains levels, saves, and demos, it also contains the game's models, sounds, textures, skyboxes, and more. And if you copy them all to the support folder, then for each of these folders and files, if something is there, the game will use that in place of its own contents. As you may have guessed from its name, Marble Arena 2 is in fact a sequel. In the loading screen, you might notice that underneath the game's logo is Brightside Entertainment, and this is the studio that created Marble Arena 1, along with these Treats Adventures games. But what exactly is it? Well, according to ModDB, apparently they're a large group of only 2 people, but with the enthusiasm of 100. Now I feel like this is a bit trivial, but also it's kind of integral to this Iceberg. The base folder inside packages contains custom levels. The level saving system, at least for Marble Arena 2, is relatively cryptic, albeit still usable. You can save levels in place, which overwrites the previous one, or saves it as untitled by default if not saved already. Saving a level creates a new folder with 2 separate text files for its name and description, as well as the level itself inside of it, simply named map.ogz, because other names don't work. And also creates a bunch of BAK files with that OGZ file, which are backups that can be renamed to OGZ, but how is anyone supposed to figure that out? If you select the Save As option, the file name field is the name given to that folder, which is a bit confusing, and if you put spaces, it can't properly load it. Anyways, file info apparently says these files are maps used by games built with an engine called Cube 2, and they're stored in compressed gzip. Now the extension of a gzip file is gz, which macOS can apparently open natively. So I tried renaming the extension of these files to that, and I was actually able to decompress them just by opening the file. Although to recompress them, you do have to use terminal. I will get to the thick of the iceberg shortly, but there is one last thing over the surface. As that commenter also alluded to, you can actually record replays by checking the box for that in the menu before loading a level, and stop it through the escape menu at any point. Now at first glance it might seem like this is a video being saved somewhere, which I initially thought when I first came across this. Well, if you look closer, you can see the file just saved as a DMO type file according to this log, along with where it saved it. And if you look at a video of someone using this, you can see them panning and moving around the player. So they're actually caching the player's position, sound effects, and other nonsense every frame, and not pixels. The way you load these DMOs is via the multiplayer section, which is pretty obscure, and as I also alluded to, didn't work. Additionally, these are also Cube 2 files according to file info, and apparently also created by Duke Nukem 3D. Now I've seen a few people talk about this, and as far as I can tell, that game is pretty old, firstly. In fact, it's for MS-DOS. And second off, it's more than slightly problematic in its stereotypes, and in the way it represents women. And alas, it likely does not record replays in the same format, and it's a different game. And even so, they might not even be interchangeable between levels. And while it could have been derived from Duke, it might also be using its own method. The file info page also links to a Cube 2 engine game called Sauerbraten. This is actually a first-person shooter game that was first released in 2004, so it's obviously a very different game. I tried to play this, but unfortunately could not get it to open. Apparently though, it contains a very similar editor to Marble Arena 2. Everything about this looks very similar, including default textures, modeling, copy and paste system, etc. If you look inside Arena 2, you can actually see some unused textures like these muzzle textures. These might have been for guns originally featured in the Cube series. If you look in the contents of either Marble Arena 1 or Cube 2, you'll also find OGZ files. Marble Arena 1 levels can be opened in the sequel. The only problem is the lighting is kind of dull, although it can be fixed by simple recalc. All of these levels that are in this Oldies but Goldies tab in Marble Arena 2 were in the first game, including this one. They don't have edit protection, star requirements, or grow mode, where the player gets heavier as they collect stars, which the original game did seem to have, likely because it can't read them properly. As for Cube 2 levels, these are of course made in a very different game, so they were made to use resources from that specific game. Interestingly, they can be opened in Marble Arena 2. Just create a new folder where the custom folder is, and name it something short form, because the game was never designed to list this many levels, so it shows multiple tabs through them if there's too many, and doesn't have scrolling. First, it can't handle most of these levels, so it simply crashes. Second, because they were made in a game with different resources, something that makes sense in Cube might seem random here. It's almost like a different language. So a model that makes sense there is a random model here, and the same goes for textures, etc. In fact, some of the properties of these items are set outside their intended range here because they were set to control something entirely different. A thing I've gone further into more recently is that Cube 2 is in fact also a sequel. The games listed on their site consist of Cube, the original game, and Assault Cube, which is a fork of that, as well as Cube 2 Sauerbraten, and last but not least, Red Eclipse, a later game which again was a fork based on Cube 2. All of these games are open source, but if you look at Wikipedia, Cube 1 actually originates in 2001, so not surprisingly, it's flat out incompatible. Luckily though, Assault Cube dates back to 2007, and actually has been updated for quite some time, and I was actually able to run that. There's something about these old graphics combined with these environments that just seems nostalgic somehow, for likely the same reason that old computers and other 80s tech is so nostalgic and interesting to me. Did I mention all of these games have editors? That of course includes this game, and it's built in the Cube 1 engine, whose levels are not OGZ, but CGZ, and they're not interchangeable. In fact, it actually has key differences from Cube 2. So for instance, Wikipedia says it utilizes a pseudo 3D world model similar to the Doom engine based on a 2D height map, imposing some limitations like prohibiting rooms above rooms. By the way, they also say it was used in Brown Uni Computer Science course, which I think makes it clear how much of a learning tool these engines can be. As you can see here, these limitations mean that you can't extrude the sides of anything like in Cube 2. You can texture them, but it will apply it onto all sides of that wall. Contrast that to what Cube 2 is using, which was octrees. Octrees are cubic cells that can each divide, or branch if you will, to 8 octants that can then subdivide even smaller, up until, in this case, it hits a 1/16th limit, which is 4 recursions in from default, or volumetrically, a 4096th. The other thing about Cube 1, for the invisible walls that are used to block the player from going to some areas, it's not handled by assigning physics materials to parts of the base map, but rather by using clipping box objects. Pressing the H key with something selected will turn that selection into a height field. But I found that to be sort of glitchy, and I can't figure out how to do anything that actually looks like hills, which seems like what that's for, like pointing and scrolling to sculpt out hills. Also, if you try and zoom out beyond the floor and ceiling, you can see this strange glitchy effect, and this actually brings us to our next point. So these FPS games, especially with Cube 1, were far more reliant on a command console that came with the Cube games than the Marble games, even just for doing simple things like creating and saving maps, and changing properties of an item after adding it. If I create a new map, I can more easily illustrate what's causing this glitching. If I try and pull out a wall from either direction, you can see there's always a 1 unit gap here. That's because you're supposed to use F to classify your selection as wall. And once you do this, you can now clearly see this wall is actually blocking the view of exactly what the game is glitching when zoomed out, which it does to reduce strain on the hardware. This is called occlusion culling, and this game uses it so it's only visible if you look over where the wall ends, which never happens in gameplay. Marble Arena does have a command console, which can be accessed with tilde, comma, or period, the last two being shortcuts to existing replace and set entity functions. The catch is, it's a lot less reliant on them, making them at least mostly unused to my knowledge. I mean, even if you accidentally press those keys, you're still likely not familiar with the game's editor, let alone the command line. If you look at these Cube games though, they're all thoroughly documented because the command line was a key pillar of those games by design. And we can actually uncover an entirely new area of Marble Arena from this, because the games were based on the same engine. So for example, Fulbright is a common command used to disable lighting multiplications, and it takes in 0 or 1 after it. 0 means it takes any light maps into account by multiplying with textures, and 1 displays the full brightness of said textures. By the way, entering just the value name will print back what it's set to instead. More impressively, let's look at a variable that only a command can access. Environment maps can be used to approximate surrounding reflections, most usefully in dark areas where you don't just want to reflect the sky background. although it generates maps that are kind of fuzzy by default, most notably in the reflection of flat stuff like glass that doesn't have normal maps. Enter end map size. This value defaults at 7, but entering that followed by a different number will actually change the quality of the maps. And I believe the dimensions of these images both double every increase. If I put 10 here, it won't do anything. Yet. The reason why is that you still have to manually refresh it. There we go. Now it's a lot crisper, and you can see the detail and textures on things it was actually capturing. In contrast, let's set that to 4, which is the minimum. Now when I recompute it, you can clearly see just how drastically blurry this looks. And again, this is universal. There's no way of changing it for individual captures. Even if you change it and recalc them individually, it calculates each of them once you reload. Import Cube can actually use the game's functionality to import CGZ files. This is all incredibly interesting, and that ain't the half of it. Frankly, I could go on a whole new tangent on that. For the sake of this video though, this segment is getting long, so we have to cut somewhere. What I've yet to mention is that macOS versions after Mojave do not support older 32-bit apps, and before that, Apple has actually warned about them being unoptimized. Unfortunately, that does also include Cube 1, Cube 2, Assault Cube, and Red Eclipse. Except that last one apparently. Now at first glance, the game's levels look kind of simple and modern, a stark contrast to how textured and grungy the older games are stylized to look. And I could not find any edit mode option in the actual interface, and just pressing E didn't work. On further inspection, however, you can access the game's console and use an edit command. By default that puts you in spectate mode, so to actually edit anything, you'll have to use F2 as it says right there. And sure enough, it looks very similar to the other games. The entities are different, but that's because they're in a different game. There also seems to be new features, like real-time lighting, as well as volumetrics, e.g. fog. So see these god rays shining down through the trees there. The biggest difference is the level type is not OGZ, but rather MPZ. But on the bright side, if you do want an editing environment that's based on this engine to mess with, this is very similar to those games. In fact, they released the game to Steam relatively recently, and I believe are continuing updates. One other thing about Marble Arena is this plugins option you can find in the tool menu. On further inspection, it seems like something would appear here if you have something applicable to add to this plugins folder, either in the app or in the corresponding support files. If I search for Cube 2 plugins though, I can't find anything on this. It does seem like CubeScript, the language used by the console, can actually be programmed using CFG files. And if I add one to that folder, then select plugins in the game, you can see it actually shows up here. So theoretically, you might be able to write CFG files as text to automate any task set in this game. And again, there's plenty more commands. And that is the cliffhanger I'll end this on. I might explain more of the commands later, but for now, I hope you found that interesting, because I certainly did researching all of this, which has been over quite some time, ever since that commenter first said something about item properties. Regardless, I encourage you to let the algorithm know, and as always, thanks for watching.